record. So for the last number of years, we've been doing a session around Rabbi Kronish's birthday. And it's also around Rabbi Jolt's birthday. That's Rabbi Davis does that one. And we had that a couple of weeks ago. And this one is in honor of Rabbi Kronish, not really about him at all, other than the fact that he was a devoted Zionist, actually a labor Zionist. He was very involved in labor Zionism, which was the dominant Zionism from 1948 to 1977, the Labor Party, which was based in kind of socialism as a economic base and as a theoretical base. And that was the dominant kind of movement. It was Ben Gurion. Most of the Zionists that many of us know about, Chaim Weizmann, Golda, Rabin, they were all kind of part of that group called Labor Zionists. And he was very involved in that. He was president or chairman of the local chapter. He was involved nationally. He was involved internationally. And he certainly established that as one of the fundamental principles of Beth Shalom, being a Zionist congregation. So what I thought we would do this evening is kind of a Zionism 101, talk about what that means, Zionism, what it has meant, and what it may mean today. And just talk a little as how the process that we call Zionism developed. So I sent out, Lois sent out today, I don't know if you received it, a timeline that involves, you didn't get it, well, I'll be showing it. So the first thing I want us to think about is there are certain words that we use pretty regularly, but we don't have a general agreement on what that means. So for instance, the word feminist. We use the word feminist. For some people, that may mean I believe in equal work for equal pay. I believe in women's rights to equality before the law. I may also believe in a woman's right to choose. But for others, it might be much more ideological, much more extreme. There is the group that are anti-patriarchy and actively involved in attempting to tear down what they understand to be the male dominant culture, who also call themselves feminists. There are people who call themselves feminists who are Orthodox Jews or Orthodox Christians who may not believe in a woman's right to choose for other reasons, meaning it's about being a feminist. In that case, it's about their belief in when life begins and how they understand in the Orthodox Jewish tradition, how they understand the halacha. In the Catholic tradition, we have feminists who would still follow the church's view, particularly about abortion. So another word that often is not agreed upon in its meaning would be an American patriot. To be a patriot. What does that mean? Well, I may feel to be a patriot for America is to actively fight for what I believe the values are inherent in the founding and the development and the idea of America. Someone on the extreme right wing might believe that being an American patriot is assaulting the Capitol on January 6th. We both may use the same words, but we have very different meanings. And that's very important in our understanding of the word Zionism. Zionism and to be a Zionist. So I don't know, do we have any anti-Zionists on this call? Not that we know of. No one's willing to admit that. Okay. Oh, Roger, you're willing to admit that?
I don't know if I'm willing to admit it. I don't really, to tell you the truth, I don't understand what it all means to be a Zionist or an anti-Zionist. I mean, it's a terminology. I know there's a Mount Zion. I know it's third Herzl. I don't want to get ahead of the class, but I don't understand. Zionism is racism. I don't understand really the concept, why it's called Zionism. I really, it's beyond me for some reason.
Okay, well, that's a perfect segue. So I'm showing you now a study done out of Brandeis and the ADL. And to tell you how fresh this is, it was published in February of 2024. So it's about a year old. So it was well after October 7th. And it reflects a lot of what people feel. This was done with 1,800 plus people. Not only a small group, 100 and something were Jewish. This is the general population. So first, we're looking at American Jews. And here were studies done in Chicago, Los Angeles, Portland, Oregon by the federations. And this is what the study said. When the question was asked, I describe myself as a Zionist. You can see 40, 42, and 26% said that they described themselves as a Zionist. It didn't ask for a definition here. But when you look at the second one, I feel proud of Israel's accomplishments. Look at the numbers there. They're double and even triple in the case of Portland. And then I consider it important to travel for Israel to be a Jewish state. Look at those numbers. Also in the same area. And then I consider it important for Israel to exist as a refuge for the Jewish people now and in the future. It wasn't asked in Chicago, but the numbers are even higher in Los Angeles and Portland. So calling oneself a Zionist seems to be very different for most people than saying, I support Israel as a Jewish state, and I believe Israel, I am proud of being supportive of Israel. Right? There are twice as many people that would say they support Israel as a Jewish state than call themselves Zionists, at least in this study. So I'm going to show you another slide from this study. Here. The whole idea of what it means to be Zionist. So they asked people who identify as Zionists and people who identify as anti-Zionists. So Roger, we're getting to a little bit your territory now of how to understand this. So if we look, Zionism entails belief that Jews deserve self-determination in the land of their heritage, that Jews are indigenous to Israel. Zionists say 54% agree with that. Anti-Zionists say only 14% of them agree with it. Now, what's interesting is many people believe that anti-Zionists don't believe Israel has a right to exist. But here we have 14% of anti-Zionists saying that Israel has a right to determine itself and that Jews are indigenous to Israel. Now, it's a small percentage, but it's still a significant group, a minority. If we look at the second line, Zionism entails support for Jewish sovereignty in the land of their own. It's almost equal between Zionists and anti-Zionists who were asked. Again, we're talking about the general population here. We're not asking Jews. We're asking the general population. Third line, Zionism entails belief that Israel is the Jewish homeland. Suddenly, for anti-Zionists, that plunges down to 6%. So they distinguish between a land of their own and sovereignty and a homeland. What you're seeing is that nobody is clear in their own mind, not the Zionists and not the anti-Zionists, on exactly what it means to be a Zionist or an anti-Zionist. Let me look at two more here. So look at these numbers. They're similar numbers to what we had. Actually, I'm going to skip this one and go to the last one. Here, what is Zionism? So I would like, Bobby, you like to read for us. Don't you please unmute and read these. Okay.
Zionists believe in Jewish self-determination in the land of our history and heritage. Zionist, someone who supports the idea of Jews having a right to live in Israel and control Israel, who supports the colonization of Israel by Jews and the violent displacements of the Palestinian people who have been living there. I feel like Zionism today cannot be separated from colonial action. A Zionist is a supporter of Israel without conditions, someone who prioritizes support for Israel when voting for elected official. I think the word has lost all meaning, to be honest. It means believing there should be a Jewish homeland. However, it does not mean that said country needs to be only Jewish. Oh, who knows? It's a mess.
All right. Now that was the study. And as you can see, Roger, you're not alone, right? In the study, it's all over the board as to how people understand the word for Zionism and anti-Zionism and what it even means. And part of that is because the whole idea goes back over 100 years and it has evolved. So I want us to look and describe the process that got us here and to think about the various different ways that Zionism evolved. But to understand that, before I share the timeline, let me say that the whole process of imagining a Jewish state was so outlandish that it was totally dismissed in the 19th century when it was first proposed. Not by Herzl, but even before that. People had talked about it all throughout the 19th century. And why the 19th century? Because that was the century of nationalisms, right? That's when most of the nations that we know today were born as nation states. America was born at the end of the 18th century, France at the begin in the 19th century, Germany at the end of the 19th century, and many of the states were being born as individual states separate from, in some cases, religion, in some cases mixed with religion. In the case of England, they have a national church, but the power of the government is not tied up in the church. In other states, the church was much more prominent. In Tsarist Russia, the Orthodox Church was very much part of the government. In communist Russia, which was the 20th century, it changed. But these were all nation state building at that time. So nationalism for many peoples was evolving. And the idea, though, that this diaspora Jewish community living in over 100 nations, you have to take that in. In the 19th century, we lived in over 100 different sovereign places in the world. That's not true today, but that was true in those days. We lived almost everywhere that you could identify as an independent place, Jews lived. How could it be possible that this community could actually form a state? How could they actually come together? What sense did that make? Jews lived in Africa, they lived in Asia, they lived in Europe, Eastern and West, they lived in South America, they lived in North America. How would that happen? So nobody could really conceive of this for a long time. It seemed like a fantasy. But some things started developing, and now we're going to go to the timeline. Let's see if we can get you there. There we are. Got the timeline? You don't have it.
Description of your.
Oh,
No.
we're going to get there if I can. I want to move. There we go. Come on, come on. Now my thing doesn't want to. Do you have it, Jeff?
Yeah,
Jeff must have.
I'm controlling the Rabbi.
Can you control it down? No, the other way? Yeah, let's get to the timeline, right. Okay, so look at 1853. This is kind of the first official. Now remember, we don't get to Herzl until the end of the 1800s. So this is at least 40 years, around 40 years before Herzl. Abraham Mapu, most of you probably have never heard of him, published Mapu is a street. All of these guys are streets somewhere in Israel. Everybody we talk about is a street. He published a novel called Ahavat Zion, The Love of Zion. And it was a biblical story, but it talked about the land and it was very romantic. And I don't know how many of you saw the movie about Abraham Lincoln with what was Daniel Day-Lewis playing him. But if you remember toward the end, he's in the carriage with his wife, Abraham Lincoln, and he says, I would like to go visit the Holy Land. Christianity in America in the middle of the 19th century was enamored of the idea of visiting the Holy Land. And in fact, Mark Twain actually did visit the Holy Land, and he published a book called Innocents Abroad about it. And it was a very romantic kind of thing, even though it described Israel as being an impoverished outpost with all kinds of dirty people of all different religions. So Mapu starts it. Then you have this man named James Finn, who is the second British consul in Jerusalem. And he had a proposal to persuade Jews in a large body to settle here as agriculturalists on the soil in partnership with Arab peasantry. So it was a British guy who made a proposal to Britain to allow this to happen, to facilitate it. And therefore, after that, the word was out that it was starting to percolate, and this Zion Society was founded in Frankfurt, Germany. And they founded a new neighborhood that many of you have been to called Mishkanot Sha'ananim. Any of you have been to Israel? You know where the windmill is? Outside the wall of Jaffa Gate? Do you know? Yes? You know where the big windmill is? That's Mishkanot Sha'ananim. Right outside those walls. That was founded by Moses Montefiore, and it was in collaboration with this Zion Society. So we start to see the development of little areas in Israel. It's not Israel yet. It's still Palestine, and it's controlled at this time by the Ottoman Empire, which is Turkey. Any questions so far? Yes, Roger, unmute, please. You can all unmute if you'd like.
I still don't understand what Zion means.
Oh, okay. Zion is a mountain outside of, right on the edge of Jerusalem. Have you been to Jerusalem?
Yes. I don't remember the windmill, and I know that there is a mountain there, but why did they choose this name?
Because it's in the Bible. The Bible calls the Mount Zion. Mount Zion is where King David traditionally is buried. It's right outside the old city walls. If you remember where there's a gate that has bullet holes all over it, you probably, if you've been to Jerusalem and done the tour, you've seen the gate with all the bullet holes all around it, where in 1948, the Israeli Haganah tried to retake Jerusalem from the Jordanians and failed. Right outside that whole area is called Mount Zion.
Oh, the cemetery, yes?
Well, there are cemeteries there. There are also churches
Right.
and synagogues. Right. And in fact, Schindler is buried up there on that mountain. So that mount is called Mount Zion. There are many mountains around Jerusalem. It's traditionally said 7. But Mount Zion had a name that was associated biblically with Jerusalem. So when you said Zion, you were saying Jerusalem. All right? That's where the word comes from. So Zion comes from that hill, and therefore they started to take that name, but nobody had yet made it into a movement. So then we had this book, a very famous book by Moses Hess called Rome and Jerusalem, where it really raises the question of Jews returning to the land of Israel. And if you look, he proposes a socialist country. Now, I want to remind you that in the 19th century, there were very few democratic countries in the world. Anything that we would call democracy, very few existed in the world. At that time, socialism was still a theory. There weren't socialist or communist countries. These were all new ideas that were percolating around. And he talked about the redemption of the soil. But nobody had called it Zionism yet. So in 1862, Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer publishes this book called Drishat Zion. Seeking Zion is what that means. And he says that Jews will only be saved if we follow the promise of the prophets and we turn to ourselves to save ourselves. And religious Zionism kind of sprung from that, but it wasn't called that yet. Any questions yet? You with me so far? Roger, we haven't got to Zionism yet, but okay.
The Kalischer, isn't there a Kalischer Rebbe or something like that?
Well, Kalischer is a name. People got names from places,
Okay.
right? So Kalischer was the name of a place. Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer happened to have that name. There might be a Kalischer Rebbe. There were a lot of Rebbes from different movements of Hasidism. I don't know who the Kalischer Rebbe would have been, but it could be. Jeff, could you move it up, please? Okay, second page. There we are. So here we have in 1870, Mikveh Israel is founded by the French Alliance Israélite Universelle. That was pretty good.
Not bad.
So it was the first Jewish modern agricultural center. Remember the British guy proposed an agricultural movement? 20 years later, Mikveh Israel is established now by the French. It's kind of the French federation system. They found that area, Mikveh Israel. And then this new group arise called Chovevei Zion, Lovers of Zion. Remember there was a book called Chibat Zion, The Love of Zion, that was early on a novel? Well, now they take their name from it. They call themselves the Lovers of Zion, and they set up over those 20 years 30 Jewish farming communities in Palestine. All we have now are the beginnings of an agricultural movement of some Jews, small numbers, coming to Palestine, which is controlled by the Turkish Ottomans. Okay? There's no movement yet, There's only ideas and a little bit of a project or two to start bringing a few Jews and teaching them agriculture and settling little areas. Okay. In 1878, German language memorandum was addressed to Bismarck, who was the prime minister of Great Britain, and Bismarck, who was the head of Germany. Disraeli was British and Bismarck was German. It was submitted to the Congress of Berlin, which was a group of nations that met there, by an anonymous Jewish group about establishing a constitutional monarchy in Palestine. Now, I want to remind you, democracies were rare. Socialist countries didn't exist. Monarchies were the norm, right? These were empires. Europe was empires, the world, Ottoman Empire, Japan Empire, China Empire, Russia Empire, right? So they imagined at that point, let's have a Jewish empire. Let's bring back the King David Empire. Ideas were percolating. Some people believe it was Yud Lamed Gordon, Judah Leib Gordon, might have been the one who proposed it. It's not clear. And Bismarck was probably right when he called it a crazy idea. But a crazy idea, we should remember, it's 1878, right? He called it a crazy idea. In 1948, that crazy idea will exist in a real form. It's pretty miraculous what happened. Okay. I just put in there 1878. Tikvatenu was written, became Hatikva eventually. Took time, it was a poem. But now look at 1878, very important time. Petach Tikva is founded. Petach Tikva still exists. If you've been to Tzfat and you come down the mountain, you find Petach Tikva. Oh, no, that's wrong. Petach Tikva is outside what is today Tel Aviv. Right, I don't know why my head, I was thinking of Rishon, my head is no, Rosh Pinaz I was thinking of. But Petach Tikva was founded and it was abandoned because they couldn't get it settled. Eventually it got settled 4 or 5 years later. Now, all of these groups are trying little things. So, Jeff, if you would scroll, you can read as we're going through. I want to get us, here we are. Thank you. In 1881, the pogroms in the Russian Empire start. And at first they just kill a few Jews, but eventually they'll kill over 250,000 Jews, and they'll slaughter communities all over between 1881 and 1920. That first movement, a number of Jews left and went to America, and a group of Jews went to Palestine. And if you look at 1881, that's when Eliezer ben Yehuda made Aliyah, and he began to revive the Hebrew language. So he started to plant Hebrew as the language. Up until then, very few people spoke Hebrew. He and his family and a few others spoke Hebrew in the entire world. People prayed in Hebrew, but they didn't speak in Hebrew. Then we get Leon Pinsker. He wrote a book called Auto-Emancipation, and he urged people to strive, Jewish people, strive for independence. And now we get Rothschild. Baron de Rothschild starts buying land in Palestine to settle agricultural groups. And we have the first Aliyah. It's called the first Aliyah. You can see it's about 25 to 35,000 Jews coming to Ottoman Palestine, mainly from Eastern Europe. Okay, Jeff, could you move it, please? All right. Now we get Rosh Pina, Zichron Yaakov, Rishon LeZion. These little towns get founded. Now the movement is starting. Jews are starting to come, but it's still in the tens of thousands. It's still relatively small in number. And this very important man that you may never have heard of, Nathan Birnbaum, coins the term Zionism. See it, Roger? 1890, we finally have a word for what this is. And what is this? Nobody knows yet. All we know is that Jews are starting to move back to some kind of entity that might take shape in the ancient land of Israel, which is now called Palestine. All right? It's only a smattering of movements trying to figure it out. 1894, we know about the Dreyfus Affair. Herzl is covering it. It seems to be a motivation for him. And in 1896, he writes Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, and he actually advocates for Jewish state. And he describes that state. Now, he was dismissed as crazy in 1896. Between 1896 and 1904, when Herzl dies, he will die in 1904. Look at those dates. He has 8 years. He will establish the Zionist movement, the political Zionist movement. It's not religious Zionism. It's not cultural Zionism. It's not agricultural Zionism. All of these existed at that time. The idea of settling the land as farmers, that was agricultural Zionism. Cultural Zionism from Achad Am. We should settle and speak Hebrew, and we should just live in the land, live with the Arabs, go back to our roots, but not establish a state. That's cultural Zionism. There was socialist Zionism. We should bring socialism and create a socialist utopia. There was communist Zionism. We should build a communist state and build communist utopia. By the way, though, as far as we know, there was no democratic Zionism early on. But somehow, the early Zionists decided when they figured there should be a state, it should be a democracy. So Herzl calls the first Zionist Congress in 1897. And women are given the right to vote in the Zionist movement. And Herzl defines Zionism as the national movement for Jews to establish a state in the land of Israel at the beginning, or what is called the land of Palestine. He also founded the Zionist Organization of America, the World Zionist Organization, and the Federation of American Zionists. And if you look at 1901, in the Fifth Zionist Congress, they established the Jewish National Fund to start buying land and selling trees. The trees was secondary. They were actually buying land. Trees came later. Then Herzl published a novel called Alt Neuland that took place in Palestine, where he imagines what the land will look like when it's a state. It's really Germany, as he saw Germany, in Palestine. By the way, Alt Neuland, old new land. Keep that name in mind. We're about to run into it again in a different form. So now there are more pogroms in Russia. You can see now thousands are being killed. They can't agree in the Zionist movement, this political Zionist movement, these congresses, they can't agree on where they should settle. Most of the delegates want to settle in Palestine. But the Ottoman Empire won't give up Palestine. They try. Everyone beseeches the Sultan. He will not allow for it to happen. So they propose that we go to Uganda, which is controlled by the British. And the British are willing to settle the Jews in Uganda at the Sixth Zionist Congress. And Herzl supports it. And he is, for the first time, booed by most of the delegates, and they turn it down. And they say it has to be in Palestine. So a new Aliyah occurs called the Second Aliyah, and about 40,000 Jews come from Russia. Mostly because, as you saw at the end of Fiddler on the Roof, they're getting killed. Their villages are getting wiped out. Most of them are coming to America. That's how most of us got here. But some of them are going to Palestine. And look at Tel Aviv, founded as the first Jewish city in modern times in 1909 by the Zionist movement. And why do they name it Tel Aviv? Because a tel is ancient and aviv is spring or new. The Alt Neuland, the old new land, they name it after Herzl's novel. Tel Aviv is named the Old New City. And it's outside of Jaffa, and it's the first Jewish city established since antiquity by Jews for Jews. Any questions yet? All right, Herzl is dead now, right? So the movement has continued on, this political movement. And they continue to meet, they continue to have congresses, they continue to try and get people to settle the land. At this point, no one has yet defined what that land will look like once Jews create this entity. We don't know how it's going to be governed. We don't know what the structure will be, but we do know that they've created some elements of it. They have a national bank. They have a national land holding. They will eventually create a kind of national army, a small army that will exist in Palestine. But World War I is about to begin. And with World War I comes the war against the Germans by the West and against the Ottomans. The Ottomans join with Germany. They lose that war, and therefore they lose control of Palestine. And now there's a thing called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where the British and the French divide up the Ottoman Empire, and the Brits get Palestine. Okay, so the Jewish Legion is formed in 1917 with Joseph Trumpeldor and Zev Jabotinsky. They fight in World War I for the British. Then you have this great moment in 1917 where the British government, with Lord Balfour proposing the declaration that proposed the establishment of Palestine, of a national home for the Jewish people. That is the first time any established state, and this was an empire, right? Britain was an empire at that time, the largest empire probably in the entire world. The sun never set on it, right? That's how powerful and big it was. And they established that in Palestine, a national home for the Jewish people, the British government would support it. Okay. That is the beginning of the legitimacy internationally of the right to Jews to have their own state in Palestine. It is established in British law.
Why?
Well, why is a big question. Some used to say that it was because Chaim Weizmann invented explosives that helped the British win the war. Nobody knows exactly. Balfour, there were a lot of Brits that were Philo-Semites. You had Disraeli, who was he had converted to Christianity, but he was publicly known as a Jew. There were a lot of Jewish people in the House of Lords by then. There was a movement of supporting Jews in Palestine. We don't know exactly the reason why they voted for it, but Balfour always was a supporter of the Jewish community and of the movement to Israel. Questions? Okay. So now we get massive pogroms under the Russian Revolution. I want you to look at these numbers. I don't know if you've ever seen them. 70,000 to 250,000 civilian Jews are killed in those 2 or 3 years. Jewish orphans exceed 300,000. About 40,000 Jews arrive in Palestine. Now, the American border is about to close. It closes in 1924. That's why we had set up orphanages all over the Jewish world. In the early part of the 20th century, almost every Jewish community had Jewish orphanages because these kids had nobody to look out for them of all different ages because so many adults were slaughtered and kids were left homeless and orphans. Okay, we still have no definition yet of what it will look like for the Jewish state, if it is going to be a state. We only know a Jewish homeland, a national home, will exist if the Brits follow through on their word. Chaim Weizmann in 1921 becomes president of the WZO at the 12th Zionist Congress. Britain grants autonomy to Transjordan under Crown Prince Abdullah. Now look what just happened. Britain has promised the Jews but not given it to us. Britain promised the Arabs under King Abdullah and gave it to them in 1921. That's where Jordan was founded. The British just gave it to them. They just created Jordan. They said, bang, you're a state. Do whatever you want. And it was a monarchy, right? It was run by, and still in many ways is run by, the king. The San Remo Conference of 1920, you see it right there, 1920? No, 1920, San Remo Conference. The Allied Supreme Council, that's the group that were the winners of World War I, agreed to a mandate for Great Britain over Palestine, and it would be renewed and issued by the League of Nations. They founded the League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations. America never joined the League of Nations. Wilson tried and he failed. And so we were never a part of the League of Nations. But look at what was founded in 1920. The Histadrut, which is the labor union, the Haganah, and the Vaad Leumi, the National Council, which was the governing body of this Zionist movement. Still yet to be defined, Roger. We haven't got there yet. The only definition is we want an established Jewish homeland in Palestine. What it will look like, what other than that it means, we don't know. Okay, so let's jump a little bit ahead. Jeff Little, thank you. You can see that in 1923, Jabotinsky founded another party, a breakoff. Its youth movement was Beitar, and it was called Revisionist Zionism. It was much more radical than the WZO, the World Zionist Organization, headed by Weizmann. It believed that the way to establish a land for the Jews was to physically attack Britain. And it started organizing to undermine British rule. So now you look in 1924 to 28, there's the fourth Aliyah, brings another 82,000 Jews. You know, some were leaving. You see 23,000 left eventually. When Jews came, some left because it was too hard. And then we get the fifth Aliyah, which was driven by Nazis coming into power in Germany. And then you have about 250,000 Jews over that period arriving. And that was the last named numbered Aliyah. We didn't call it that anymore. the fifth Aliyah. Okay. Again, what's happening during this time is in the Zionist movement, they are arguing about what it should look like, how it should be governed. Should we give equal rights to Arabs who live there? Should we kick the Arabs out? That was one of the plans. Should we make an alliance with Jordan and build together? Who should we ally with? Who can we trust? And remember, the Jews had no weapons yet. They only had a few guns and pistols, homemade bombs. They didn't really have the ability to create a real army yet. Okay. 1937, the British propose a partition between Jewish and Arab areas. It's rejected by both parties. That's 37. Okay. What? Yes, Bobby.
Or did they have borders? Like where this, whatever what we wanted to call it, was, or was it just open land?
No, the proposal, the British, what they proposed had borders, but neither the Arabs nor the Jews accepted that proposal. Just like, as we're going to get to, if you look down, you see that the United Nations proposed in 1947, proposed a two-part, came out of the Biltmore Conference, where they actually proposed two states, one Jewish, one Arab, and they had boundaries, they had borders. And that's what the Jews accepted. We accepted the borders the United Nations voted for. So the League of Nations validated the Balfour Declaration, which came out of the San Remo Conference. The United Nations validated the partition and offered it. Israel accepted it. The Zionist movement accepted it. The Arab nations rejected it. The definition of Zionism up until then was very amorphous. It was establishing a Jewish nation in the land of biblical Israel, governed by Jews, with rights for Jews and those who live and remain in Jewish lands. And that's all it was. It was about establishing a sovereign Jewish nation in the land of Palestine. They didn't even have a name for it. Yeah. So when we first discover, now, Jeff, if you go up a little more, these are things you know. We have the wars, the various changes. During all of this time, Zionism has continued to change and evolve. The word Zionism. Okay, Jeff, thanks for sharing. Let's go back to seeing everyone. Thank you. So what I would say in closing, because I'm going to have to finish in the next few minutes, I have to go on and lead a group at 8, is that the word Zionism probably should have been retired once the state of Israel was established. Zionism was the movement to establish the state. Once it got established, that should have been it. But we had established a World Zionist organization. There were Jewish organizations called Zionists all over the world. Nobody wanted to give that up. The diaspora Jewish community wanted to have a say in the Jewish world of Israel. And so these groups continued. And it became that being a Zionist was supporting the state of Israel after 48. That's all it was. I support the state of Israel. I believe the state of Israel, and I give money to help the state, or I go there, or whatever. That's all Zionism was. And then Zionism began to be, I support the government of the state of Israel. And then it began to be, I support the settlers, for some people, of the state. And then it began to be, I'm against the Jews who are settling the Arab territories. And I'm an anti-Zionist. I don't believe that Jews have the right to kick Arabs out of their homes. Or I don't believe that Jews have a right to a land and a country. Now, all that was settled in 48. It's an actual fact. Israel is a country accepted by the other countries of the world and validated by them. When Israel was founded, there were only 51 nations in the United Nations. Today, there are over 200. We are one of the older nations. We've been around now 77 years. We are actually one of the older democracies. We were founded the same year as India as a democracy. We're as old as India as a nation, and Pakistan as a nation, right? We've been around a long time, and why it's a democracy is because the Zionist movement decided that's what it should be. And the Zionist movement decided they should give equal rights to all citizens. Has it played out that way? No. Has American democracy played out the way we would like it to? No. But we keep working at it. And some people today look at Zionism and say, I think Zionism means that Jews are colonialists. And many of us say, no, we're indigenous. That's our homeland. Our nation was born there. We have always had Jews living there. That's a fact. We have a right to settle back in our land. So Zionism as a word, Zionist, anti-Zionist, it depends who you're talking to. And I would always ask you, if you get into a discussion with anyone who says anything about it, to ask them, how do you define Zionism? What do you mean by it? Before you get into an argument. Because you got to at least know what they think. It's sort of like when you talk about God. You know, I may reject the same God you reject. And you may accept the way I understand God. Once we define it, once we talk about it. But just saying I'm a Zionist, what does that mean? I know what it means for me. For me, I support the state of Israel. I support the Jews who live there. I know they have the right to exist. I don't believe it. They have that right. And the state of Israel is a fact. So I don't use the term so much Zionist. I'm a Jew, and I believe the state of Israel is my spiritual homeland. And if I lived a different life, it would be my actual homeland. But in the meantime, I live in America, and I believe in supporting my people who have developed a wonderful state in the land of Israel. And I'm proud of it. Not everything it does, any more than I'm proud of everything America does. But in that sense, I'm a Zionist. And if you agree with that, then you're a Zionist like I am. And if you have a different view, okay, we'll talk about it. So thank you all for joining me this evening. And I hope at least you understand a little bit of the development of Zionism. Roger, okay?
Honestly, I'm still confused.
Well, that's because your teacher was not very good.
No, your teacher is very good. It's me. I'm a little dense.
All right. Good night.
All right. Good night.
Thank you, Jeff.